Venting in physics is when you release pressure from a system. Venting in psychology is when you release negative emotions. And if you don't get into the regular practice of releasing emotions over time, your emotions are going to be like that balloon. It'll pop up at work when you're driving. It'll pop up in your relationships. You'll snap at your kids, your partner, right?
You went from putting people to sleep to waking people up.
And that's what led me to research high-functioning depression. How do you keep moving forward instead of getting stuck in the past?
Judith Joseph, MD, is a board-certified psychiatrist, author, and conductor of the first peer-reviewed research study on high-functioning depression. Dr. Judith completed her adult psychiatry residency at Columbia University and her child and adolescent psychiatry fellowship at NYU Langone Medical Center. Today, she's an assistant professor of psychiatry at NYU and a chair of the Women in Medicine Initiative for Columbia University. Her latest work focuses on helping us to overcome hidden depression and to reclaim our joy.
Let's start off with your superhero origin story.
Okay.
What got you interested in studying mental health?
Well, so initially I was like many people who are in my Caribbean culture. I'm from Trinidad originally, grew up in the church, and I was raised to believe that mental health was actually somehow a personal deficit. Like it was something wrong with you if, let's say, you had depression, anxiety, or schizophrenia. In fact, in the church community I grew up in, people who had psychosis or were seeing things or drug issues, they were thought to have spiritual possession. There was something wrong with them. It was their fault. So after I went off to college at Duke and then went to medical school at Columbia and seeing what mental health issues really are in the brain, I knew that this was not something that was a personal defect. This was something based in organic roots. This was a brain issue. But I still didn't want any part of it. I actually became an anesthesiologist after graduating from Columbia Medical School. And at that time, anesthesiologists made a lot of money. So my parents were like, good, you're going off to medical school, you're a real doctor, right? But 2 years into that, I was just feeling like, this is not why I went to medicine. This is not how I want to help people. You put them to sleep. It's a very important job. You got to, keep them asleep, not moving, alive through a surgery. But at the end of the day, you don't see these people again. And there was no real connection. So when I switched into psychiatry, which is my true calling, and really talking with people and going into my own therapy was when I actually started to buy into this idea of mental health.
I love this so much. You went from putting people to sleep to waking people up.
Yes.
That's powerful. That's really powerful. And also, of course, having a similar cultural upbringing is just like crazy. You don't want to be crazy, and so you just don't talk about it. If you're having any kind of issues, you just keep it to yourself. And so thank you for sharing your superhero origin story. And obviously, you've been in this field for quite some time now, and you've learned a lot, seen a lot, helped a lot of people. And your specialty now, and what you're really helping to bring forth in the popular conversation, which is super important. It's one of those things that has existed for quite some time, but we didn't have a term for it. And it's called high functioning depression. So why did you make this your focus for your research, and also just being able to help people with providing some tools for this particular issue?
Well, I mean, when people meet me and they look at me, they would never think this is someone who has struggles, right? You see someone who on the outside has it all put together, all these degrees and accomplishments, runs a lab, always on TV. But, like many people like myself, on the outside, I'm put together, but on the inside, I have struggles too. And I often say that psychiatry saved me because when I became a therapist, the program offered all the residents in training pretty much free therapy. And I remember starting with my therapist and being like, what does this guy know about me? He's like this rich white guy on the Upper East Side of New York City. I'm from Trinidad. I come from scarcity trauma, having very little when I came to this country. What does he know about me? But boy, was I wrong. Like, he unpacked so much of my trauma. And, for people like myself who have come from little or who have parents who have generational scarcity, many times we will work ourselves to the bone. It's never enough, right? Like, even though on a conscious level, we know we have resources, on a deeper level, it's like, well, I can't ever slow down. I got to collect the resources. I have to do this next big thing. And then you're on to the next. And that was my origin story from my personal high functioning depression. I was sitting at my desk in 2020, and I was giving this talk to this major hospital system in New York City. And I was the voice of healing and reason in April 2020 when everyone was freaking out. But halfway through that talk, I was like, oh my gosh, I think I'm depressed. And it kind of snuck up on me. So it led me to wonder how many people are just like me. We wear this mask of pathological productivity, but we're really struggling. And that's what led me to research high functioning depression. Because in my research lab in Manhattan, in order to meet criteria for depression, you got to go through this long checklist of you have low mood, or you have anhedonia, which is a lack of interest and pleasure in things, a lack of joy, or these other symptoms like low energy, changes in your sleep, changes in appetite. You go through the checklist. And at the very bottom of that checklist, if you don't meet that box that says you're lacking functioning or you're in distress, your healthcare professional will say, well, come back when you break down, right? And I just thought that was such a broken model. Why are we waiting for people to break down? Why aren't we teaching them about the signs and symptoms of depression or mental health conditions so that they can actually do something about it before they break down? And you're in the longevity world. If someone came to you and said, let's wait until you develop stage 4 cancer and then we'll do something about it, you'd be like, what? Where'd you get information, right? Or with menopause right now, we're seeing this big boom in longevity science where we're saying, let's start the hormone therapy before the osteoporosis, right? And, if someone said, let's wait till you have a heart attack before we actually address your risks, you would be like, oh my gosh, where did you go to medical school? But in psychiatry and in mental health, we're still in the dark ages. We're still waiting for people to break down before we do something. I'm saying, let's change that.
Yeah, I love that. It just seems much more logical to approach things that way, but this is the way that our system is constructed right now. And fortunately, there are things that are being changed, and you are at the forefront of one of these particular issues. And this model has served in certain ways of, again, like keeping people alive. And one of the things that I shared years ago was that with longevity, we're not living longer right now, we're dying longer. And the trend of extending our lifespan, it actually reversed about 2 decades ago, but we're still just like, we're living longer each year. It actually reversed for the first time. We're the first generation to experience this. Every generation prior lived longer and longer and longer, but it reversed. But also we're just kind of keeping people alive, keeping them ticking, but our quality of life is suffering. And let's talk about how we can fortify our health and prevent this stuff by addressing our very human needs. And your work is really, one of the things that really stood out for me was right now we're all dealing with I think it's an environmental mismatch from our needs, right? In the world that we're living in. And so some of your solutions are so like hidden in plain sight, just right in our face. But if we're just caught up in this busyness and this like hustle mentality and, there's the FOMO and all the things, we're going to just keep burying ourselves in a way. And so if you could, can you talk about some of the specific symptoms? Because when people think about depression, they think about a certain state, right? We can visualize what depression looks like. This is very different, and it can be a little bit tricky to see. So can you talk about some of those symptoms? Like, how would we know if we're experiencing this?
Yeah, you're right. The world is completely different. And when you think about your grandma's depression, right? The depression 40, 50 years ago, they didn't have to deal with what we're dealing with in terms of digital exposure, right? We cannot escape our face these days. You look at a phone and the first thing you see is your face. It's so unnatural. What happens when we look at our faces all the time is that we get distracted. We're getting these emotional loadings that we didn't have before. We're fixating on the way that we look and we're judging ourselves and our confidence dips. So there's just so much information at one time. And if I were talking to you right now and my face was next to you, I would not be listening to you. There's a reason why we're not supposed to look at our faces when we talk to others. We're supposed to be getting information from our environment. Are you safe? Are you engaged in what I'm saying? How am I making you feel? It's a survival tool, but we're so distracted. And that's just one of the ways that we're missing out on our health. I always say that we have this idea of happiness and health, right? The idea is let's live longer, right? But that's not what we should be thinking about. The idea of happiness is let's just meet this one milestone, and then it's on to the next and on to the next. But we're missing out on the experience of joy. And the idea of happiness, the idea of what, success is in terms of health, that's what it is. It's just an idea. When we get to that marker, we're always looking for something new. But when we are present and we experience joy in the moment, we're actually fulfilling the reason that we're here as human beings. We were built with the DNA for joy. It is our birthright, but we miss out on it all the time. And here's an example. So when you're eating your food, and you do a lot of work in nutrition, we're supposed to be savoring our food. We're supposed to be having a social experience with our food. Why? Because the way that our body receives nutrition is broken down differently when we're actually chewing and savoring and letting our body do what it needs to do in its time. But many of us, we're so busy in front of a screen that we're just shoving the food in. We're not getting good nutrition because we're stressed. We're making poor decisions about what we actually decide to ingest. And so we're missing out on these basic points of joy. And the reason I say points is because in my research lab, the way that we measure whether someone's healthier or happier is by adding up these little experiences. So when you eat your food, did you savor it? When you took a nap, did you get rest? When you were feeling lonely and you reached out to someone, did you feel connected? These are all different points that we actually add up to measure happiness. But in the real world, regular people are like, oh, well, happiness is and success is when I live till 80, right? But like you said, on paper, if you live until 80, but your life is joyless, then you're missing out on the whole point of it. And joy is something we need as humans to thrive, to survive. There's a reason that people who are in countries where there's no running water, where they don't have resources, they're still able to laugh and be happy, right? It's because they're accessing these points of joy that we leave on the table because we get busy. But that's a long-winded way to get back to your answer of high-functioning depression. It used to be thought that depression was you're sitting in bed, you can't get out, you're crying all day, you're feeling sorry all the time, you're mourning things, right? But that's one face of depression. It's still an important face, right? We need to acknowledge that some people do struggle and they're not able to do anything. But we also have to acknowledge this other face of depression that doesn't look sad. In fact, this new face of depression doesn't really feel much of anything. They have something called anhedonia, which is an old scientific term meaning that you're basically lacking joy. So you feel meh, blah, things don't light you up anymore. And these individuals, on the outside, they're still doing what they need to get done, right? They're the single mom who's still getting her kid to school on time and showing up at work. They're the entrepreneur who's still taking care of the business and making sure everyone gets paid, but really joyless and feeling nothing. They're the healthcare professional who takes care of the patients, but they're not even meeting their own basic needs. So you're having these symptoms of depression, but you're not breaking down. In fact, you're doing the opposite of breaking down. You are overfunctioning. You are overproducing. And as the first researcher to publish the very first peer-reviewed study in the world on high-functioning depression, what I have found is that these individuals all have unprocessed trauma or past pain. And instead of dealing with that trauma, they avoid it by busying themselves. So it's different than burnout. So burnout is a workplace phenomenon. With people who are burnt out, being in the workplace actually causes the stress and the pressure. So when you remove that person from the workplace, they should get better, right? It's literally a workplace phenomenon when you look it up in the WHO guidelines. High functioning depression is different. Even when you remove these people from the workplace, they're still busy. They're taking on a side hustle or two, or they're helping their friend with the project, or they're cleaning out their garages. They just cannot sit still. When they sit still, they feel empty. When they're not working, they feel restless. And it's an avoidance of processing pain by busying yourself. But because of our capitalistic society, they're getting rewarded. They're getting the message that they're doing a good job, that they're okay, but they know something's off. And they end up in my office with anhedonia, that lack of pleasure. And they're like, Dr. Judith, I don't know why I'm not happy. I don't know. I have nothing to really complain about. I have all these things. And I'm like, yeah, but you're lacking joy. You're missing out on your birthright as a human being.
What can happen if this goes on, and would this possibly transition to classic depression?
It is possible. I see that all the time. You know, people can dip into the clinical depression where they stop functioning. But also what can happen, because the mind-body connection is so real, is that their bodies break down. So a lot of my clients will actually end up in my office because they're referred by a neurologist. And the neurologist is like, there's like, I don't see anything on the labs. There are all these like physical symptoms. And then it turns out that this is unprocessed pain. This person is just running themselves ragged, and it's manifesting in bodily symptoms. It can also manifest as, you know, people coping negatively with overusing substances. And when I say substances, it doesn't necessarily have to be like a drug or alcohol. You know, it could be gambling. It could be excessively shopping. It could be excessively using, you know, social media, you know, because you're trying to self-soothe. You know, you're trying to fix something. You're trying to feel better, but you can't sit still. So you're doing things that are actually harmful.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you brought this up, because unfortunately, we have epidemics of chronic diseases, just like they've exploded recently. And most people are unaware that this can largely be tied to your mental health and what's going on in your mind and stress. And, you know, obviously you were trained in the biopsychosocial model, and understanding how much our thoughts and our disposition and our emotions, literally, it changes our chemistry. Just when we have certain thoughts, we feel it, you know? So there's a master controller of our hormones and our neurotransmitters and what our cells are doing. And there's no cell in our body that is, you know, just off on its own. Like, I'm not listening. You know, every cell, our trillions of cells are getting this data based on our thinking. And so knowing that my way of being and my thought process and how I'm living my life, this isn't just about the food I'm eating or sleep, and those things matter deeply. But we can also think ourselves into poor health, right? Heart disease risk, obesity, Alzheimer's, the list goes on and on for these chronic diseases being tied to our mental health, right? You know what is crazy is that we separate the two. And you know this. This is part of the issue. And thankfully, again, it's changing with modern medicine, which is separating the mind and the body. You know, as if your mind is just off on its own, you know, doing its own thing. This is existing within that amazing body of yours. And so what your work is doing, we're going to get into all this, it's treating ourselves from the inside out and the outside in, right? And so it's a multifaceted, multi-layered approach. And that's why I think you're seeing such success with it.
Yeah. Well, you know, as humans, we're doers, right? We want to strive. We want to control our outcomes, but we've strayed from the basics. When you look at earlier civilizations, the thought leaders, the ones that we worshiped really, were people who lived in the spiritual world. You know, they understood the importance of being still and looking around you and acknowledging that you can't control things. But we have evolved into this group of hyper neurotic people who want to control everything. We want to live longer. We want to do this. We want to sleep in ways that are beneficial. We want to eat in ways, and we're just like trying to control everything, but we're missing out on the basics, right? By being so busy and by being so caught up in our heads, we're not able to access the basics. So we have to slow down. We have to let go. And we may be doing all these things to live longer and live healthier, but our mind is so busy and stressed out that many times we're unraveling all the hard work that we're doing because we're not able to actually tap into what's really at the core. Where's this fear coming from? This fear of death, right? So many of these, thought leaders are chasing like living longer. But what is it about living longer? Like why is it that you want to be here so long? Or are you trying to outrun death? You know? So I think we do have to learn how to sit still, you know, and I'm guilty of it too. I used to chase all the accolades. When I moved to this country, I was all about curiosity and learning, and I loved to learn. It wasn't about the grades or the fear of failure, but over time, the more evolved I got, the higher I got, really the less evolved I got, right? Because if I really was in tune with what matters, I wouldn't have been chasing all these things, right? Chasing the idea of happy, but losing out on the joy.
Yeah. And we get those little temporary little bits of, dopamine or whatever the case might be, just to keep us in that race.
Yeah.
And, You said the thing that I wanted to get to this at some point, which is I mentioned earlier that we have an environmental mismatch from the way that we're designed, mind, body, and spirit. And we live in this culture with 24/7 access to everything right in your hand, And I remember we were talking about older movies earlier and AI and all that stuff. And, if AIs listen, I don't want no problems. All right. But just keeping in mind that there was one called Cyborg when I was a kid. I was super into Arnold Schwarzenegger movies, Jean-Claude Van Damme, these tough guy, whatever. And Cyborg was one of those movies with Jean-Claude Van Damme. And it was just this possibility of being merged with machines, man and merging with machine. In many ways, we already are. Most people don't even get away from their phone. It's a part of who they are. And if they lose their phone, they lose their mind, right? And so this kind of exposure is something so new in our human story. And I wanted to talk to you about the importance more than ever of having time to process, because we don't do that. This is something that just would have happened for our ancestors just a few decades ago. There was time. Do you remember being bored?
So my daughter, she constantly says to me, Mom, I'm bored. And I always imitate her because she says it like that. I'm bored. And I'm like, good, because when I was a kid, talk about bored, we lived in this really small apartment. It was like my mom and her 4 kids, because my dad was still in Trinidad, still working. He's older than my mom, so he had to retire there first. So we would be so bored because we had no cable. And we would just like cut up boxes and do these little skits and play. We used our imaginations. And so that is so important. When I work with these children in my practice and I ask the parents, I'm like, how often are your kids using their hands? How often are they really engaging all their senses? And they're like, never. They're on their screens or they're on social media. And, when you think about losing all these points of joy, we're losing them every day when we're not engaging in our senses. There was actually this study that recently came out from one of the University of Texas schools where they took these adults 18 and over away from their smartphones. So they gave them regular, like their phones, and they disabled the ability to go on the social apps or to be on the internet. So it was basically like a flip phone, right? They could still text and communicate, but they didn't have the ability to be immersive in the internet or be on social. So 2 weeks away from the smartphone capacity was almost like giving them an antidepressant in terms of their scores. And, the researchers are like, oh my gosh, what's happening here? It turns out that when you're not on your phone all the time, you're actually talking to others. You're actually getting better sleep. Remember those points of joy, like rest, connection. You're in nature more. So you're having that experience of awe. You're moving more. So you're getting that point. So like literally being on your phones the way that we are is causing this tech depression to happen. And when you poll those people who participated in the study, every single one of them said, I think I'm on my phone too much. So they knew it was a problem, but they just didn't know how to get away from it.
I think one of the most important takeaways from this is, depression can show its face in many different ways, right? And today with our modern personality template or our social conditioning, it's like, again, we're human doings, right? Not necessarily human beings. And so we're just doing so much. And it can be easy to miss when we're not well, especially if we have some type of purpose we've attached to our psyche to. So this could be, taking care of our family. This could be something with our work and something we're passionate about there. But what tends to happen, as you mentioned, is that with high functioning depression going unnoticed, we eventually can crash out, right? And so we can have this health scare or health breakdown that takes place where suddenly everything gets turned on its head. And now, the person that's self-sacrificing for everybody else, now they're requiring all the attention because I didn't take care of myself, right? And I know you've seen this pattern a lot. I see it coming, right? And I know you do too. I just know, I know the people, I know the personalities. I'm like, yo, what are you doing? You're headed in this particular direction. And what you shared was this ties back primarily, this is one of those hallmark symptoms of the onset of this is trauma, past trauma. And what you were clarified in the book, by the way, because, you know, some people might see trauma as like, I had a good childhood, you know, nobody abused me, nobody, you know, I didn't have anything particularly bad happen. I wasn't in a war, right? These things that we often attribute to trauma, right? So just for me, for example, I didn't know that I had PTSD, right? Just growing up in an environment to where pretty much every night there's gunshots, you know, we are on the lookout, even though life is like, we're having fun and we're doing stuff outside, you know, we got, you know, maybe it's the summer and, you know, somebody messing with the fire hydrant, whatever, all these kind of, you know, but then we also have to be on the lookout for a drive-by, right? I didn't know that those things, I was carrying these things with me into my very recent adulthood. It was just like a blind spot. And it wasn't until I went for a walk with my wife a couple years ago, and I'm walking in my neighborhood that I take this walk all the time, and a police car drove by us, and it was like at least 2 minutes later, and I'm still like looking back. I'm waiting for them to come and, you know, approach me like, what are you guys doing here, right? And like going to stores, which I've been with my wife and having an incident where I'm in a store shopping, and this is when I was doing clinical work, and somebody called me and they were asking about a health condition that their aunt was dealing with and wanting to help. And so I spent, you know, it was maybe a 5-10 minutes giving them some advice. And then I bought some stuff. As soon as I walk out the door, security, police officers, because somebody called because I was in the dressing room, apparently too long. And just these stories of like, and so now I think about that when, you know, when I'm shopping, like, is somebody, why are they asking me, do I need help? Why do they keep asking me, you know? And these things I carry with me that aren't necessarily healthy or aren't necessarily true. But I think that these are maybe protective mechanisms that I've developed. Help me out. Talk to me.
Well, I'm glad that you're being vulnerable. And I know it's not easy. It's so important, though. And you'll notice that I talk a lot about my past, but for many years I didn't. You know, I was the only person of color in many of the spaces that I was in. And also the most broke. Because a lot of people, they come from a lot of money and resources, right, at these fancy institutions. I was not one of them. So for many years, I didn't talk about it. I hid it. And if you carry yourself a certain way, people just assume, oh, your parents must be doctors, right? No, I'm the first doctor in my family, the first college graduate, right? But you would never know. Because one of the things about trauma is that it makes you feel as if somehow you're to blame for what happened to you. And it's a trauma response. Internalizing guilt and shame and blame is actually a result of trauma. And scarcity trauma is something that you won't find in the textbooks, right? The textbooks were not written for people like us. Let's be real. So you'll see a lot of things like combat. You'll see things like assault, but you won't see things like, well, you know, were you worried about having food? Were you worried about growing up in a dangerous place? You know, were you worried about being kicked out of your house because your parents couldn't pay the rent? You know, so I wanted
all of the above. Check all those boxes for me. Yeah,
I wanted to be expansive and inclusive with my trauma inventories because I was so tired as a researcher, turning people away. You know, when you are involved in these studies that are overseen by the FDA, you have to be by the book. Many times they're recorded and taped. And so for the patients coming into my lab, you know, they'll say something like, you know, I've been through a trauma because I was in a divorce and I lost everything. And my ex was very toxic. And I literally didn't even know if I was going to be able to, you know, survive because of my financial resources. And they would have these symptoms of trauma related to financial stress, but I couldn't put them in a study because according to the DSM-5, they don't meet criteria. It's not a physical violence. It's not near death. It's not combat. So off the record, I'd have to say, I believe you. I know why you're in fight or flight, but I can't put you in the study because, you know, the textbooks say you don't meet criteria, but I believe you. So I wanted to create an expansive and inclusive trauma inventory to include all these painful situations like growing up in a dangerous area, you know, not having finances, you know, having these rejections and this maltreatment because of the way you looked or because of the way you identified or because of who you decide to love, right? And so I also wanted to include things like generational traumas and collective traumas because those are not included in the typical trauma inventory. So when you go through the checklist in my book, you're going to be like, wow, these things are traumas? Yes, they are emotionally painful and significant. They have shaped the way that you see yourself. They've shaped the way that you interact with others. They have shaped the way that you even approach the world. And so acknowledging and accepting that these things happen to you, that it's not your fault, and that it impacts the way that you behave is very powerful because that can change the way that you approach life moving forward.
Yeah. And I believe we can get stuck, at when that trauma happens, maybe it happened when you were 12. And so a version of you kind of gets stuck there and you approach things as a 12-year-old with certain things. And, again, there's no cookie cutter way to go about this and healing, but you did a great job of addressing and helping to unpack some of these things for ourselves. And you shared in the book these 5 V's of healing and being able to overcome this. And I was so grateful because, and I want to ask you about this as well. The term depression is so invasive in our culture now. It can kind of get thrown around a lot, and it can become something that becomes somebody's identity. It can become something that people use and they hang onto that and use it as a tool. But depression, sadness, all the variants that can form in depression, these are human emotions and we have them for specific reasons. Like it's feedback, it's emotional feedback. And so I want to ask you about this and being careful maybe about using the term depression and self-diagnosing and becoming obsessed with whether it's depression, anxiety, or all manner of mental health issues.
Yeah, well, in the demographic that I'm studying, they will actually reject the term depression. It is more culturally acceptable to walk into a party of high functioning folks, high achievers, or just people who are just functioning, right? Like showing up. It's more acceptable to walk in and be like, I'm burnt out. Because you'll hear, me too. Yeah, me 3. Who's not burnt out? Ha, ha, ha. But walk into that party and say, I'm depressed. It's like crickets. Like, oh, you should see someone about that, I do think that there's still heavy stigma. Yes, there are some circles who will, hold on to a label just to have something to hold on to. And I'm seeing that especially in younger generations because it allows them to feel connected. It's not for them to just have something as an excuse. It's really a way to say, I'm a part of this group. Can you help me? Can I share my experience with you? Can we help each other, right? I think it's a phenomenon we're seeing, especially because of social media, where people feel lost, they feel alone. And by saying, I'm depressed, oh, I am too, there's some common bond and there's this community, which is different for older generations. The older generations, they'll say, oh, you're just labeling yourself, or I'm rejecting that. I'm not depressed. I'm burnt out. The problem is that they're using these skills for burnout and they're not getting better because they don't realize that it's not burnout, it's depression. And there are many reasons for this depression. Like I said, this world is different. We have processed foods that we didn't have before. So we're losing points of joy because our brains are undernourished. We're sitting at desks all day on Zoom meetings. We're supposed to be out in the world walking. We're not supposed to be, just planted in one place. Even when you think about the lack of virtual meetings, in the traditional meeting setting, you'd be, oh, how are you? You'd be going across the room. You'd be looking different. You'd be getting those movement, that different feedback. Now we're planted in front of a computer. We're looking at ourselves. We're looking at 10 people at the same time. We're so stressed. We don't want to mess up. There's just so much happening to our brains these days. It's just so different. The greed, the corporate greed today, like 30, 40 years ago, a handful of billionaires. Now, like there are so many billionaires. There's so much greed, just milking the little man, And the little man is no longer very little. It's like the majority of us, right? So there's just so much going on in our world today. Like the amount of information we get, the access to all of the bad news all of the time. This is a new depression. We need to start naming it and saying, this is depression. This is anhedonia. And let's do something about it. And that's why I wanted to develop the 5 V's, because traveling the world and looking at different cultures, there are certain numbers that pop up throughout everywhere I go. The number 5, because we have 5 fingers, most of us do. The number 7, because 7 days in a week. There's certain themes. And I wanted people to think of something that they could, imagine and envision. So I want people to look at their hands and say, I'm built with the DNA for joy, but I lost track of how to access it. And to tap into one of the 5 V's, 1 or 2 every day, not all 5, just to reclaim those points of joy. Because the idea is you want to get these points. You want to get a point here or there. You're not trying to chase this idea of happy. You want to access joy daily. So the first V is validation. Validation is important because many of us, we just push down how we feel all the time. It's our coping mechanism, right? Like how you said, you didn't access that pain, you just pushed it away. But the problem with that is that if you push down that pain, then you eventually push down the availability of joy as well, because you're just pushing down emotions. That's your coping skill. And it is so important to acknowledge and accept your emotions, because in psychology, when people don't know how they feel very confused, uncertain, and they don't know how to react. They don't know how to behave. So I describe it as being in a very dark room and you can't see anything. And you hear this loud crash. Some of us would start swinging, some would start running, some would start screaming. But if you turn the light on and you saw, it's a vase that fell, I'm safe. It's the same thing that happens when we're able to name and identify how we feel. Oh, I'm angry right now. Okay, that's why I feel this way. Or I'm afraid, or, I'm feeling lonely. These are all important things. We have to acknowledge and accept how we feel. So validation is the first step.
So what I wanted to do was to set the stage, and we're going to go through all of these 5 V's and dig in and get some more insights, is regardless of where we feel we are on this spectrum from, when we kind of talked about that, the ignorance of depression being an issue and just like, you better get up, we don't have time for that, to this is my identity. I need this to feel connected, to the messy middle, to where many of us today are experiencing at some point depression, and we're not paying attention to the data that it's giving us. And with high functioning depression, we can run ourselves right into the ground or crash out, as they say. And so with validation, you talked about in the book 3 types of validation, right? And I want to go through each of these if we can, just get a little bit of insight. There's self-validation of experiences was one of them. Mm-hmm. Can we talk about that?
So it's so important to acknowledge how you feel. If we push it down, we get so confused. I see a lot of people coming into my office and, they'll say, I have anger issues. And I'm like, okay, tell me about that. Well, I behave in an angry way. Well, behavior is different than the root cause. What is it that you're feeling? And they're like, well, I just told you I'm angry. No, you said that you were behaving in an angry way, but what is it that you actually feel? And a lot of times it's not anger, it's fear. I see this with a lot of the men that I treat, and when we get to the root of the fear, it's often a fear of either running out of resources or a fear of just not being enough or being rejected. And then when they realize that this is actually fear and anxiety, this is not anger, but I'm behaving in a way that's angry because I'm yelling at people, I'm like cutting people off. Then they're like, wait a second, let me do something about this fear. Why is it that I'm so afraid? What is it about my past that makes me afraid of being rejected, of being unlovable, of not being able to provide? And when we unpack that, it really opens up this whole different world and this whole different access to why it is that they are the way they are. And then they change the way they behave.
Next was self-validation of emotion. So we have self-validation of experiences mm-hmm. and of emotions mm-hmm. as well. So what's the difference between the two?
So experiences is this happened to me and this is why I'm like this. Many times we reject the past, like how you were saying, you were just like, well, everybody grew up that way, Well, just because everybody went through something doesn't mean that it didn't impact everybody differently, but that's something that I faced a lot in Caribbean households. It's very common for people to have this dynamic where one parent goes to the new country and another parent stays home. And everybody's like that. That happens to everybody. Well, it doesn't mean that it's not painful, right? That's an attachment trauma because, you're used to being with two parental figures, and when one is away, it hurts. But it's something that a lot of families don't necessarily accept. But this experience happened to you. And just because it happened to everyone doesn't mean it wasn't a negative experience. So that's the acceptance of the experience. The acceptance of the emotion is different. And that's what I was talking to you about with the being able to name and accurately identify the emotion. And sometimes people have a really hard time with that part because either it wasn't modeled for them growing up, right? If you grew up with people who didn't really express or acknowledge emotions, then you're going to be like that too, most likely, right? So there's a list of these emotions that I actually put in my book because I want to be as nuanced as possible. And I ask my clients to pick different ones. Don't pick the same ones. Like, see if you can acknowledge different ones, because that gets them into the mindset of validating and self-validating their emotions and also their experiences.
Oh, wow. Yeah. I mean, I can see that my personality would be in a way of like, I don't need validation, like I got this. I'll just, despite this thing and not necessarily looking at it, see how it's impacting me. So what about verbal validation? So this is the third one.
So verbal validation is actually getting that from someone else. Usually it's from a therapist, but it could be from a partner. It could be from a friend. In my therapy practice, I do a bit of verbal validation, but I also do a bit of factual validation, which is next on your list. For mental health, it's just so sometimes like abstract, right? Like, let's say if you have a heart health issue, you go to the doctor, they can do an EKG, they can check your troponins, and they can show you, look, this is what's happening with your heart. But with mental health, we're not there yet. There's emerging data where we can show some fMRI data to show some correlations, but it's not really direct causation. So you can't yet scan someone and say, this is what you have, right? We could say, these are things that we see as patterns, but we can't definitely say, this is your brain scan and this is what you have. So for many, the quantitative validation is really powerful. That's why I have so many assessments in my book.
Yeah.
Because in the lab, when I'm working with someone who has severe trauma and I do a CAPS-5, which is a trauma inventory used by the VA hospital, it's the gold standard for trauma. And I show them like, wow, your CAPS-5 is so high. They're like, oh my gosh, that's why I'm this way, right? So that validation allows them to feel less self-blame. I'm having a hard time in relationships because of, this high trauma score. This is what it makes sense to me. So being with someone who can actually verbally validate what you're going through and also showing you quantitatively that this has happened to you and, it's not your fault can be so powerful.
Yeah. Yeah. I can absolutely see that. Even though I might think I don't need that, it feels good. It feels good. I think it's like a human need just to feel seen.
Yes.
To feel like we matter and our story matters. And so you mentioned factual validation. So what is that?
Yeah, well, that's one of the assessments is really helpful. And I have so many assessments in my book for that reason, because people listening to this may be like, well, I feel off. I just don't know what it is. And I encourage them to take the anhedonia quiz. Because when you see the areas of your life where you're lacking joy, you may be like, oh my gosh, I never even realized that. I never realized I was doing that. And it's empowering because when you feel off and you don't know what it is, it's almost like you're in that dark room that I described where you can't see it. So you feel confused. So you start swinging, you start doing things. The swinging could look like drinking too much, right? Or overdoing it at work. But when you know what it is, and you're like, oh, I'm lacking joy, I'm lacking interest, I'm a human doing, not a human being, then let me tap back into things that can help me to access that joy again.
Amazing. You go way deeper in the book into validation and provide just strategy after strategy, practical things we could do ourselves, but also with a therapist, friend. You give many different options on how to go about these things. We'll talk more about that as we go along. Let's get to the next V. And this one is venting. Mm-hmm. So what does this mean, first of all, and how does it help?
Well, in my lab, I often have these demonstrations where people come in and I I explained that venting is a term in physics. So when you blow up a balloon, and I have a red balloon in my lab, and you try to push it down in water, I ask everyone in the room to see if they can push it down. 100% of the time, they can't. The numbers don't lie. Physics, there are physics laws, right? You can't defy it. But then I ask each person to deflate that balloon slowly over time. And eventually, it's a flat balloon and you can push it down easily, right? So venting in physics is when you release pressure from a system. Venting in psychology is when you release negative emotions. And if you don't get into the regular practice of releasing emotions over time, your emotions are going to be like that balloon. It'll pop up at work. It'll pop up when you're driving, cut somebody off. It'll pop up in your relationships. You'll snap at your kids, your partner, right? So it's really important to express those emotions over time. And venting is not the same. Healthy venting is not the same as trauma dumping, right? So like many of us, if we feel a certain way, we're like, it's healthy to vent. I'm going to go and tell this person, I'm going to tell that person. But you really want to be careful about that, because the recent data is showing that when you vent without asking for emotional consent first, right? And this is not to a therapist, this is to a friend or a partner. You're not checking in with that person. You're not saying, hey, is this a good time? Or I need to talk to you. You're just going in and you're like guns a-blazing, like, hey, this is what happened. And many times we do that because we want to get someone on our side, right? So our intention isn't right. Or we want to get back at someone, or we just want to feel better and lash out on someone. And when you vent like that, you're not actually getting a resolution. So when you do vent, you want to ask for emotional consent, and you want to have an intention. You want to have a resolution in place, right? Because when you vent and you're like, I don't know if I'm going to get what I want to hear, then you're actually doing it the right way. You're saying, I may not like what this person has to say, but I know that I'm going to get closer to a resolution. But there are different ways to vent. You don't have to necessarily talk to someone. When you pay your therapist to vent, you can do whatever you want, right? Because you're paying that person. But you can vent by writing things down. You can journal, and, you can vent in the way that my dad does. He's a pastor. He will never go to therapy, but that man can pray, right? He will pray all day long and he feels good after he prays, right? So if you're someone who's faith-based, that's a really great way to vent. But if you're an artist, you can vent by singing, dancing, however you want to express those emotions. Just get it out in a healthy way with intention.
You're checking all the boxes of what I wanted to talk about. So you talked about basically how to avoid some venting pitfalls. Mm-hmm. And so, as mentioned, you dig deeper into these, but did I pick the right person to vent to? Did I ask permission? Did I learn anything? Right?
Yeah.
That part. Am I always the one venting?
Yes.
Right? And so it's just this one-way trauma dump all the time. And also you talked about, again, venting doesn't always mean it's to another person. There's solitary ways that we can do some venting, but I love that physics analogy. That really spoke to me, just understanding that if we're not releasing that pressure, we're just literally walking around exposed, and just like, it reminds me of Wayne Dyer and, this analogy he used with the orange. And when you squeeze an orange, what comes out of it? Orange juice, right? And when life squeezes you, what comes out of it? Whatever's in there, yes. Right? And so we tend to have this buildup. This could be anger. This could be animosity. This could be sadness. This could be, you name it. When life squeezes you, what's going to come out? And so we need to vent, release some of this stuff. And I know from my culture, you don't do that. Yeah. You just don't do that, And of course, I found it super valuable. And there's so many ways to go about it. This could be just a direct spiritual connection and being able to offload that. As you mentioned journaling, you mentioned expression through art. And this is super valuable, but we've got to, and I would encourage us to find a way to make it a practice, right? Check in with yourself. And is that something that we should be doing on a regular basis? Because you mentioned just being still. I think that some of these things would come up for us if we just are still for a little bit of time.
Well, sometimes I actually talk to myself, and I was like, let me look this up and see if this is a thing. And like, there are recent studies that show that people who talk to themselves and like talk through, right, your self-venting, they actually get to the resolution faster. And it made me think of when I was growing up, listening to certain artists like, Tupac and people, the greats, right? And how I think classically it wasn't, accepted to vent, right? As a strong man, like in the hood, you're not supposed to be like talking about your feelings. But a lot of the great artists, when you hear rap music, it's like, wow, they were actually venting. Like it's really beautiful, right?
I never thought about that. You're so right.
Yes.
You're so right.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Oh my goodness. And that's why, especially with Tupac, for example, so many people are just resonate so much. And it's because of that. It was the expression of emotion in a full spectrum of these emotions.
Yes. All over the world. Like when I was in college, I did some study abroad in South Africa, and like the kids, they were like listening to Tupac. And I'm like, wow, like it transcends cultures, because when you tap into that emotional, pain through artistry, it connects people. That's why it's so beautiful. And that's why it's timeless.
I didn't know we was going to talk about Tupac today, but just shout out to that, because it made it more socially acceptable.
Yeah.
And so powerful. All right. So we're going to move on to the next V. So we talked a little bit about validation and venting. The next one is values. So what does this mean and how does this help?
So values, for me, over time, you get lost, right? Like I know from being really young, the values that were instilled in me were things that gave you meaning and purpose. So even though we didn't have much, we often spent our weekends volunteering. So like it's counterintuitive, right? Like why would a family that doesn't have a lot give? But because that made us feel rich, right? Helping others. And that's why I wanted to be a doctor to begin with. But over time, I lost sight of those values. Like I would get caught up in the accolades and like, well, I just got to not fail. I just got to continue to excel. But that wasn't necessarily making me feel full and fed or rich, right? Like emotionally rich or spiritually rich. So I do think that over time, your values change based on who you're around. The more that I lost touch with my initial community and I was around people who were chasing that clout, I was finding myself chasing the wrong type of values. So I often say that values are things that are priceless, not with the price tags, right? So think about the things that really make you feel spiritually, or if you're not believing in the spiritual world, just like in that like guttural feeling, full and fed, like when you're a baby and you feel full and warm. But many of us chase the clout. We chase the things that are superficial, and it has to do with who we're around. And when you think about being on your deathbed, right? Like you're not going to be like, I want a Porsche, right? Like, or I want another car or I want to tell one more person what to do. I want that power. You're not thinking about those things. You're thinking, I want to spend 5 more minutes with my loved ones, or I wish I had done something to help more people, or I wish I had left a better legacy, right? So in my book, I actually have this diagram of this diamond where there are different values at the top, the higher level values, and then the more primitive ones at the bottom. Things like, chasing power, those are primitive. You're not going to want to boss someone around in your 5 minutes on earth, right? Your last 5 minutes on earth, but you are going to want to leave a legacy. Things like family and faith, those are things that really root you in purpose. And so many times, because of the past, you forget what your true values are. So with my patients, sometimes I have to actually work with them we're like these archaeologists digging up their past to figure out what it was that was really precious for them. And because of, bad things happen to you, many times you forget, because your brain literally will push down your memories as a protective measure. So it's not uncommon for patients to come to me and be like, I don't remember what I used to really value, or I don't remember much of my past, because it was a protective response from your brain to really shield you from painful memories. So it takes some time to unearth, the real core values. So some things that I'll do with my patients is I'll say, bring in all pictures, or we'll actually use our smartphone to go back to memories, like old memories. Mm-hmm. And it's like, oh, like, you looked really joyful in that picture. What was going on then? And then it's a storytelling, but we really are digging up the past. We're really being archaeologists to try to figure out what it was that was truly precious. What are the core things and not the superficial things?
I love that. I love that so much. And oh my goodness, that's amazing. Yeah, you were also, in speaking about with your values and who's around, you were thoughtful enough to provide a warning for us about our values. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, when you're around people often who, let's say they don't have the best, not that they don't have the best interests at heart, but they just have the superficial values. That's what they're chasing. They're not necessarily going to honor your need to tap back into things that really matter. And in my book, I talk about the risk factors for a high functioning depression. One of them is masochism, right? Masochism is an old psychiatry term. It used to be in that Bible of psychiatry, the DSM-5, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual. It was pulled out, yanked out in like the 80s because it was thought to be victim blaming. So there used to be something called masochistic personality disorder. And one of the traits of people who are masochistic was that they somehow incited poor treatment onto them. So like they incited the violence, they incited people to treat them poorly. So it was like very victim blaming. So, but other aspects of masochistic personality disorder were things like bending over backwards for people who don't really appreciate you, or sacrificing your own joy for someone else who's not really thinking about you, or feeling as if you're not worthy of praise, or feeling that you're not worthy of things that you actually do deserve. So in today's language, it would be called people pleasing, if you remove that victim blaming element. And many of us, we end up doing for others, and we don't even realize where we're always bending over backwards, where we're always showing up, where we're always the rock, we're always a strong friend. And for many, it's because we don't feel worthy, right? We internalize this shame and blame, and we feel as if we're only worthy if we're doing for others, right? We're humans doing, not humans being, right? So when you start to make these shifts towards values that are really meaningful to you, you may have to look around you, because you may have over time surrounded yourself with people who really don't have your best interests at heart. They are takers, and not because they're bad people, but it's just human nature. If you're going to be doing and giving, people are going to take. So when you start setting those firm boundaries and you're like, I want to tap into things that really matter to me, they may not like it. They may tease you, they may not support you. And that's one of the early signs that who you may need to limit. I'm not a fan of cutting people off because I'm from the Caribbean. We don't do that. But I'm a fan of limiting people access to you, like setting boundaries.
Yeah, I love that. And there's many ways to go about that. Like you just said, we don't have to completely, ghost people. Right. We don't have to ghost people, but also having your boundaries and understanding this is your life. These are your choices. Mm-hmm. And this is so helpful. And again, I want to open this up. This is so much bigger than, a certain diagnosis. These are valuable life skills, right? To be able to have this insight. And, it's just, are you value aligned with the people that you are currently with? When you decide to get well and heal, and maybe, one of your values is, self-care and, getting up and exercising. And so you can't go kick it like you were and your friend, and that's what you guys do together. Maybe the relationship is going to change. And maybe, like you just mentioned, they're like messing with you. They're talking a little shit like, oh, you healthy now, And, it's just being aware that this is going to require change. And that's the thing, too. It's like when it comes to this, people want solutions. They want change, but they don't necessarily want to change. And this is going to require you to do some work. And for us to not be afraid of this, because at the end of the day, this is freedom, right? And we are releasing that pressure. I love that balloon analogy. And so, again, just incredibly powerful values. So we're going to move on to the next V, which is vitals. So what does that mean and how does this help?
Well, I think, talking about loss is important, and to not minimize that too, because it sucks when you lose people, like within vitals, we think of you only have one body and brain, you got to take care of it. And yes, the traditional vitals are in there, like getting good sleep, getting good movement, eating the right foods to really nourish your body and brain. But a vital that's often ignored is the quality of your relationships. And it's not one to overlook, because when you do start setting boundaries around your values, you're going to lose people. And I think as humans, we fear that. It used to be thought that in the 90s, there was this whole like, leadership kind of like idea that you should be enough on your own. And if you need people, there's something wrong with you. We're independent, right? But the science is showing us the opposite of that. It's really rare in these clinical studies that I do that you will not find an element about relationships, because we were meant to be connected to each other. There's a reason that we all have attachment styles. There's a reason why the Surgeon General named loneliness as, a health hazard. It's like being lonely is the equivalent of smoking like a pack and a half of cigarettes or something like that a day, right? It is literally draining your health. And so when we do set up these protectors around our values, we're going to lose people, and it's going to suck. And it's going to trigger a lot of fear of abandonment for many of us, because rejection is very painful. When you look at the brain of an adolescent, when they feel like as if they're being rejected by their peers, the same parts of their brain light up as if it were being physically hurt, right? So like it's physically painful for adolescents to be rejected. But all of us, we all need others. So the quality of our relationships in the vital section is so important, because like I said, many of us with high functioning depression, we are people pleasers, and we tie our self-worth and our lovableness, that's not even a word, to what we do for others, our role for others. So we have to really acknowledge that and honor that. And also, it's going to be hard. It's going to be hard to lose people. So you're going to go through some pain first, but that healing will be worth it, because eventually when you tap into what really matters, you're going to surround yourself slowly, hopefully, by people that will support your values and people who actually prolong your life and don't drain from your life source. But that's, a really long way of saying that, in our vitals, we don't want to neglect our relationships. But when you go to your doctor, your healthcare professional, they only have 15 minutes. So they're going to ask you about sleeping, movement, and eating. They're not going to ask you if you're partnered with someone toxic, right? They're not going to ask you if your friends, are negative influences on you. They just don't have time for that. But I want you to think about that. Who are you around all the time? How do you feel when you're around these people? Do you feel like you have to keep up with them? Or do you feel full and fed around them? Do you feel supported? Because that is going to be a top predictor in your livelihood and in your health. And then the other non-traditional vitals are your relationship with technology, like I've been talking about this whole time, right? There's a huge focus on adolescents and children and tech, but I don't want people to neglect what technology is doing to our brains, as adults. There's an entire research center at Stanford called the Stanford Zoom Fatigue Center, because the way that technology impacts us is so important, and we just don't even think about it, but we need to think about it because we're losing all these points of joy. And then the last part of vitals is like our work-life balance. Like I mentioned, many of us, even when you take us out of work, we are still thinking about work. So it's not burnout. There's something happening in us that we have to be able to disconnect from work. But vitals, like, your whole work, your whole life's work is devoted to nutrition. And there's a whole field of psychiatry called nutritional psychiatry, where there are clinical studies that you so carefully embedded in your work. We need to really understand how what we put into our bodies changes the way that we feel, changes our risk of dementia, So eating things like the leafy greens, the fatty fishes, being careful about walnuts and eating berries, all those things are really powerful. And they're all areas where we're losing points of joy because we're just not feeding our brains.
Yes. I didn't know you were going to kick things off with the relationship component, because that's really, again, my life's work has been dedicated to food, because it was such a powerful bridge for me. But where I am today and what I see myself standing on for the rest of my career is the impact of our relationships, because our relationships are the biggest influence on what we eat, and also with this longevity conversation, an incredible study. It included over 300,000 participants. 148 studies were included in this meta-analysis from Brigham Young. And they found, yes, quitting smoking increases longevity, exercise, yes. But the number one thing they found was the quality of your relationships. In fact, having healthy social bonds or healthy relationships led to a 50% reduction in all-cause mortality. That's a 50% reduction from dying from everything.
Yeah.
And again, it stood out significantly higher than anything else. And I know it's surprising, but we're going to hear more and more of this. And the fact that you're, again, talking about this in this context and how important it is, we're so connected. There's this illusion of connection that we have, right? But there's certain things our genes expect of us. When you're talking about this Zoom phenomenon and, seeing our own face and seeing each other, it's very different from being in the room with somebody. And there are these elements. We're blind in many ways. Like humans see a certain spectrum of stuff, right? There's an electromagnetic field. There's the microbiome data that we're sharing. Your sister's here too. We're all sharing microbiome data, right? File sharing. There are these elements of wellness and connection that simply cannot be there if you have a virtual relationship. Not to negate the value of these virtual relationships. It can help people to connect and to help people to feel connected, but we cannot negate our humanness, right? And so I'm so grateful you brought that up. And also, I want to share this really quickly as well. So when you mentioned nutritional psychiatry, this got me thinking. So Dr. Uma Naidu, Dr. Chris Palmer, these are really good friends and colleagues. And the field of psychiatry is really focusing on this. It isn't just focused on symptoms. It's focused on you as a whole, complete individual. And as you mentioned, the way that our system is set up, your doctor, maybe, you said 15 minutes, that's a lot, maybe 15 minutes. And now we know that we're going to move to a model, and that is, I see this coming eventually, where we're moving away from the quantity and focusing more on quality and finding out all these things about you, because it could be that one thing you're not talking about or thinking about, it could be the big domino in this whole equation. And so this was published in Public Health Nutrition recently, and it found that individuals who eat fast food were 50% more likely to develop depression compared to people who eat little or no fast food. And the scientists found a dose-response relationship. This isn't causality, by the way. Again, it's not causality, but dose-response relationship that teeters more and more to causality. The more they're eating, the more, and it's just like, what are we making our bodies out of? What are we making our hormones, our neurotransmitters? And we get to choose that stuff. And if we're bringing all these abnormal things into this body that has had a certain way of being for so long, it could really mess stuff up. And we experience a symptom of, maybe it's anxiety, maybe it's depression. There's a lot of data on schizophrenia and nutrition today, a lot. And we're seeing the symptom, but not looking at what is the root cause. And so this is one of the very special things about your book, is that you're addressing so many potential root causes and getting us to have some introspection. And so that's going to lead us to the final V here, which is vision. So what does this mean, and how does this help us?
Well, I'm glad that you brought that up, because we talk about the biopsychosocial, and I often say in these talks that in the way that we all have a fingerprint and it's unique, we all have a biopsychosocial, and they're all unique, right? So biologically, what's happening to your body and brain when you're eating these foods that are processed, you're increasing inflammation. Psychologically, when you're not addressing your trauma, you're in fight or flight all day. Socially, when you're in these negative relationships that have your cortisol high, you're just dragging everything down, right? So thinking about yourself as the biopsychosocial model, and that doing it for yourself, like I encourage people reading the book to actually draw their own biopsychosocials, because it's a tool that was kept within our healthcare professional, walls for so long, but we need to share this with people, because people want to know how to live better lives. So draw your own biopsychosocials, and then try to get your joy that you're losing through all of those buckets, the biopsychosocial, you're losing joy there. So try to add back the joy. But vision is the final V. And it's my favorite because it reminds me to plan joy. And how do you keep moving forward instead of getting stuck in the past? So I know that in the past for myself, I would lose so many points of joy because I would work too long. I'd work too late, and I'm missing out on the time with my daughter. So now I prioritize her. And when I plan my future, I'm planning joy with her in the future. So, I get offered to speak on these big stages, and I'm like, if I'm missing out on my time with my daughter, I'm not doing it, because I know what makes me happy. I know where my joy comes from, right? And I think many of us, we're chasing this idea of happy but we're losing out on our joy. So when you think about what really brings you joy, try to plan that into your day. And I'm not talking about like a big spa day. I'm talking about like, okay, if you get your kid to school on time, sit in your living room and enjoy sit and have your coffee to yourself. Make it a ritual, something you look forward to. A simple thing. I mean, I do the same thing. I have this coffee that I got from the Caribbean, and I found a place that delivers it here. And I will sit, after I get my kid to school on time, I sit in my living room and I have my coffee, and no one interrupts that time. And I look forward to that. It allows me to sit still. It allows me to tell myself I am a human being, not a human doing. But for someone else, it could be something else. It could be, before you go from work to picking up your kid, maybe you just, take a detour and you go sit in a park and you just listen to your favorite music, planning the little things. Again, you're trying to get those joy points. You're accessing that joy daily because it all adds up over time. And it could be like celebrating something in the future, like as a family, maybe, as a family, you all haven't been spending enough time together. So you put it on the calendar. It's on the fridge. It's something you all look forward to. This is really important. And we miss out on these basic things because we're so busy planning that big family vacation where everyone's just going to be on their tablet and their phone anyway, right? So really create these rituals that allow you to access those points of joy, simple joy every day.
I love closing with this vision, because this is one of the things that, and I love this analogy of, we have this epidemic of attention deficit disorder. But my mentor, close friend, Michael Beckwith, says we have an intention deficit disorder. And being able to have a vision and being intentional about your life, the way that you want to feel. And what you're sharing with us is for us to make ourselves more available for that, make ourselves more available for joy. Because if we're in a place where joy seems so far from where we are, that can be quite a jump mentally. Like, I can't get there, but making ourselves available to it and having these little practices where we're starting to kind of fill our joy bank account and giving ourselves permission. I think that is one of the most helpful things for somebody who's high functioning is getting permission to have this time, this introspection, and to value ourselves in a different way. And so I learned a lot reading your book, and I highly recommend everybody picking up a copy. And this is one to share with friends as well. Can you let everybody know where you can pick up a copy of High Functioning and also where they can connect with you online?
Yeah. Well, thank you for having me. This was so much fun. I really, really derived some points of joy from this conversation. And, whoever's listening, just thank yourself because you didn't have to listen. And we don't praise ourselves enough for doing things that are actually helping us to understand the science of our happiness. And there's only one you, so really take the time to understand you. You can pick it up at drjudithjoseph.com, and you can follow me on all the socials there, Dr. Judith Joseph. And, if you learn something, share it with someone. That should be a part of your vision.
Boom. There it is. So please take a screenshot of this episode, share it on Instagram. Your Instagram handle is?
Dr. Judith Joseph.
Dr. Judith Joseph. Tag her like crazy. Share the love. Please share any insights that you got from this episode. I'm sure you would love to see that. And tag me as well. I'm at Shawn Model on Instagram. And this has been incredibly rewarding. I'm just grateful that you're doing this work and you're sharing your story as well. And just giving us real practical tools for us to feel better. Hey, if you like this video, make sure to check out this video right here.
I was like, I need something that I can actually do to manage stress. And I found breath work, which, you could do it anywhere, anytime, in a minute, literally in 60 seconds, you can bring your body back into a rest and digest state. And I was like, oh my gosh, I love this. Like, I feel it instantly. I feel my body calm down.